The talk today we're going to talk about is called ego, essence, and personality. So those three aspects of our psychology are very important to understand from a very fundamental basis because understanding what they are and how they operate within our psychology enables us to begin to learn how we can actually change ourselves, our psychology for the better. So when we look at our psychology, find the button down there, as I say, it consists of personality, ego, and essence. Fine. Our psychology expresses itself through our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions, which I think is logical. I think that's all fine for us to understand. And these are driven through the personality by either essence or egos. Now, we're going to talk about what these things are from a psychological or from a Gnostic psychological point of view as we go through this talk, and then we'll move forward from that basis. So, the essence within us compels us to encounter superior states of consciousness, obviously, which is a very uh, direct way of examining and potentially developing our spirituality, which is one of the reasons we're here, no doubt. The ego, on the other hand, drives us towards inferior states of consciousness or self-obsession. Um, when we talk about in this school, when we talk about the ego, we don't mean the ego as one thing, as many schools and teachers talk about it. Here, we talk about the ego as a plurality, as a multiplicity, which we'll come back to later in this talk today. But it leads us towards inferior states of consciousness. In other words, it brings us down spiritually. And therefore, our psychology is the gateway to understanding and influencing our spiritual processes. Because if we can understand the way our psychology works and how it's set up and how it's organized within us, then through our own gnosis, we're able to find the way in which we can develop, improve, and not just our own psychology, but also impact the people around us in our everyday life, which is what we'll be doing as we go through the talk. So, and through the course as well. We can say generally that our psychology expresses through our thoughts and feelings and actions. And in that way, we find ourselves in our own bubble. And that term we use very often in day-to-day um, language. But the fact is that our own bubble is what we tend to see reality, not just within, but also through. We project what is inside our own internal bubble out onto the external world, and we believe that what we are uh, encountering in our external world is something which is real, but actually it's a projection of what's going on inside us in any moment in our thoughts and feelings and actions. In other words, it's like wearing, for example, rose-tinted spectacles. Looking through those spectacles, everything else is rosy, pinky color, because of what we're wearing. In that particular example. So what we do is project our internal reality onto the external world. We'll talk a lot more about this in the coming weeks and today as well. So let's look at this in another way. Here is our psychology, and as you can see, these three different aspects, the personality, the essence, and the ego, are shown represented in this diagram. Okay. So in the middle, you can see the yellow sun kind of image. That's our free essence or consciousness. And we're going to talk about what this is in a moment. So when we say it's free, we're saying that, as we mentioned last week, that free essence or consciousness within our psychology is the part of our interior world which makes us yearn, search. It's the bit that nudges us. It's the bit that thinks there must be more to life than the rat run, humdrum day-to-day life. There must be more. And that is obviously the spiritual side. But that feeling we have within us is radiating from the free essence we have within our psychology. You can also see there those cloudy things. Those cloudy things are representations of egos. And as I mentioned, there is not one or two, inferior or superior. There is a multitude of egos within our psychology. So it's a plural, egos. And we'll come back to what they are again later in this talk, try and explain a little bit about that. But you can also see the little yellow blobs in the clouds. That is a representation of trapped essence or trapped consciousness. Consciousnesses which is held or imprisoned within particular egos. And then you can see surrounding all of that, we have this thing called a personality. And we describe a bit more about that as we get into this talk. And to understand where the personality comes from and then how it grows and develops during our life. So we're going to talk about these different aspects in this talk today. So let's begin, if I can find, with the essence. Okay. So the essence, or another name for consciousness, the essence is the divine internal part of our reality. It's the part of our psychology which is real, we could say. It is not a conceptual thing. It is a very objective part of our own gnosis, which we receive through wisdom, or rather, we could say it is interior wisdom. And it in itself, this consciousness, this essence, is or has a certain tranquility, a lucidity, extraordinary natural powers, which we'll talk about as we go through the course. And the essence, when it's activated, generates superior states of consciousness within us. In other words, when the essence is active, we're able to perceive more than just the day to day. And we're going to talk about this in much more detail. But what we can say is that for most people, most of the time, most of our essence or consciousness is imprisoned and trapped within those egos we saw on the last slide. So we're going to talk a bit more about egos later on. But the fact about the essence is that when we look at, for example, when we look at or when we meet a child, often a small baby, they have some kind of adorable nature. We feel something when we're with the baby, which is like a feeling of contentment, of tranquility. It's an expression of the essence of the child, which is what we're picking up. Because at that moment, a baby, they don't have ego, which is manifesting within them. We'll talk about that later as well. So what we're trying to explain here is that the essence in itself is something divine and eternal within each person. Okay? So the essence is something which is generally psychologically asleep. In other words, it's passive. And what we need to do, and what we'll talk about in this course, maybe today a bit, but in the next few weeks for sure, how we awaken the free consciousness within our psychology. So there's that picture again of, we did that last week, the picture with the eye in the sky. That's supposed to be the awakening of the consciousness. And there you can see in the bottom right a picture, a famous picture, I think it's pre-Raphaelite, of somebody being awoken, or rather the consciousness is being awoken in that particular image. So that's where we need to be aiming at in terms of our spiritual development from the point of view of the essence. So if we go back to that phrase to activate the consciousness, psychologically, we have to learn to be active and not passive so that we can be awake in any given moment. So if you remember last week, we were saying things like, can you feel the bum on your chair? Then you can feel your clothes on your back. Then you can feel, become aware of your breathing. All those things are happening all the time. It's just that we're not actively acknowledging them as a thing or experience of our day-to-day life. In other words, here we are, we're all sat on the chair, but it's only when we place our attention on the sensation of sitting on the chair that it becomes a living experience. What we're trying to say here is that in this course, we'll be trying to find techniques and methods to activate our consciousness so that not only do we feel or become aware of our five senses, we also become aware of what is happening internally in any particular moment with our thoughts and feelings and actions. Where is that feeling of anger coming from? Why am I feeling emotionally drained at this moment? Why do I react to the person who pushes in front of me in the queue? What happens when I get flattered when someone says what a lovely person I am because I'm wearing a certain set of clothes because I'm up with the Joneses in the fashion world? Or I decide to eat a certain food because I believe it's a trend at the moment and that food will help me. What is going on inside my psychology in those moments? Where is the truth inside my day-to-day life? We read well, in the old days, we used to read the paper. Now we scroll through the phone and we listen to the radio, maybe watch the television all at the same time. So where are we? What are we doing? Where is our point of focus in any particular moment? And so therefore we need to start analyzing in a natural way, not an intellectual way, a conscious way, what is going on inside us. And this is the beginning of the awakening of the consciousness. And when we start to awaken consciousness, we can start to see the realities about what's happening inside us, hence that picture at the top right there. So by applying this principle to our internal states, we are fully aware of the thoughts and feelings and actions within us. Only then do we start to live rather than exist. And we talked a bit about this last week. It's the state of living with a capital L rather than just existing. So this is the talking about beyond the humdrum, as we mentioned already, beyond the day to day. We're talking about living our life so we can advance spiritually. And in the bottom right there, it's got that little picture again of the striving to focus on the present, to be in the moment, and it's called mindfulness. I'm sure many of you have heard of this term mindfulness. Um, Again, we'll be giving techniques and methods to try to learn how to be in the moment as we go through our daily life. Because when we are in that moment, then we become aware of what is happening inside us. The consciousness is active in those moments. And so therefore we are able to start to understand ourselves, which after all, this is a course of self-knowledge. So that helps with that. So back to that image again of the overall psychology. And if you can remember, we talked about these clouds, and we said in each one of these clouds, which represents an ego, there's a bit of trapped essence or trapped consciousness. So let's look at these egos. So here's some examples: pride, laziness, anger, lust. I'm sure you've all heard of those. And in their fullest form, they're very easy to spot in others, and they're also very easy to spot within ourselves. But when we go through our daily life, there's often situations and moments where, like the one on the left there, don't tell me you've forgotten your purse. The lady's doing the shopping and she's scanned all this stuff and now she's got no purse. How's the guy feel? All the people behind, how do they feel? What's going on inside them in that moment? What resentments, what angers, what ironic thoughts, etc., etc. What is powering that moment within those people? Well, it's different sorts of egos. And the same on the other side. Oh, it's not my turn again to wash up. Why is it always me who has to do the washing up? And we become the victim. So there is every situation in our daily life, if we are not in the moment, then we are identified with one ego or another, which is acting through our thoughts and feelings and actions. And if it's acting through our thoughts and feelings and actions, we are not involved. We are like a puppet. We are being controlled by egos, by these psychological aggregates or details. Okay. The egos or aggregates have their own will, an egoic will, and fuel the intention that produces the mechanistic thoughts, feelings, and actions that cause us to suffer in the long run. When we say suffer, yeah, we do. It basically means that we go from situation to situation, reacting to the previous situation. And each one of those moments is basically filled with anxieties, worries, stresses, illnesses, many different things, which are very mechanistic. And we need to try and break out of those cycles by awakening our consciousness so that we can observe these egos and aggregates actually manifesting inside us. And when we start to do that, then we start to make a change within ourselves. We start to awaken psychologically. But continuing on with the ego, there's a resentment. He's thinking on the left, he's thinking about the guy on the right who's got a bigger, I think it's a cheesecake. You can decide. Um, and then we have another example. Each ego struggles to control the human machine. Now, again, um, in the coming weeks, we are going to talk about the human machine from a purely physiological and biological aspect. And then we can talk about the way in which the ego, as in plural, ego, struggles to control the human machine, always trying to be in charge from moment to moment rather than essence. Now, essence is us, is the true us, is the divine eternal spark we've already talked about. But if we are allowing, for whatever reason, any particular ego to manifest within us, then the consciousness remains asleep. The consciousness remains passive. And we, as students of Gnosis, are trying to awaken from that situation so that we don't end up with expressions of ego making us, obviously, in this case, like jammy Dodgers. I'm not sure what that guy's stacked up there, but it's a lot of nice biscuits, I'm sure. The egos generate inferior states of consciousness within us. So we can see that any particular thought or feeling or action which generates or manifests within us, and it's not to do with consciousness, it's not to do with the essence, then it is therefore something from an ego which is going to bring us down. It's going to make us spiritually exist at an inferior level. Those resentments, those anxieties, all that pride, all that anger, all that lust, etc., etc. And so there's a final example. There's a bit of jealousy going on there in the bottom right corner. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next step or part, which is this thing called personality. Personality in itself is a vehicle for either the essence or the ego to manifest. Okay, so if we are in the moment, then the free essence or consciousness is in charge of the personality. And we could say in that moment, we have the true personality of who we are. So, for example, that could be, as an example, it could be merely empathizing with somebody or being compassionate to somebody or understanding, agreeing, listening without any negative thoughts occurring. Whereas if the ego, or rather, if we are identified with any ego in any moment, if an ego is manifesting, then the ego is driving and controlling the personality. Excuse me. And that would lead us to problems. That would lead us to the body language, the feelings of stress, the feelings of uh, physiological trauma, etc., etc., and obviously all those thoughts that go on in any moment about the other person, about the other situation, about our boss, about our car, about the theatre tickets, whatever it is, we are going to have a series of thoughts, feelings, and actions related to the manifestation of the ego through the personality, which would make it, therefore, a false personality. So the personality itself, we can just move on to the next slide. For most people, most of the time in their bubble, we are manifesting or allowing to manifest through us our false personality because we are identified with all the things that are going on around us. We react to the woman with the red hat. We react to listening to something on the radio or on the DVD, and we may react by physically going for a jog because we want to look lovely for our potential boyfriend or girlfriend, whatever. So we have a load of activities, feelings, and thoughts happening all the time, which are manifesting through the false personality. So the false personality in itself is energy, and it is just energy, okay? But it is something which forms within the person between more or less the first year and the seventh year, the 1 to 7 years of a child's lifetime is where the personality develops. And that is things like language, family, brothers, sisters, siblings, parents, the schooling the person gets, obviously the country, the language of that country, the food of that country, anything in the situation of that particular country or place. Then the school, obviously, the culture we can go in talk about as well, the environment of that particular place. All of those things impact on the child, and in those first 7 years, the personality develops. And it is only after those first 7 years, when the personality is fully developed, that the ego can manifest through that personality. Okay? That's why as a child grows, it could be when they get to about seven, 5, 6, 7 years, then they start to become cheeky. They start to be pushing boundaries. They start to be acting in certain ways or copying parents or whatever, because the ego is now able to manifest through that personality and making it a false personality. Whereas if the essence is in control in any moment, and as we've already mentioned, the baby or the child when they're first born right through till about 5, 6, 7 years, they have a different lucidity about them because the ego cannot express. So the essence is able to express completely 100% through that particular child in any particular moment. So therefore we have different behaviors, and what we could say is that we have the true personality of that particular child expressing in those younger years. And so we have a situation where each one of us, as students of Gnosis, have our own particular false personality. And normally, the personality is not developed harmoniously with active essence. In other words, we are not normally in the moment. We are not normally with a active consciousness or essence. And so therefore, it is the norm that the personality is generated or created through these egos. The egos lead us to inferior problems of morbidity, delusion, and degrees of hatred as examples, okay, through the manifestation of the ego utilizing or driving the personality, making it a false personality. And often this occurs through or via social media, TV, jealousies, prejudices, preconceptions, negative images and impressions, etc., which all come from those surroundings that the person is living in, the family, the school, the work, whatever it is. Those impressions come into the person, and if they are not in the moment, then the ego reacts to those impressions negatively. Um, and so therefore we end up with a situation where people are not living with a true personality. So it means that each one of us has a vehicle, which is that personality, and either the egos are driving that vehicle or the essence, the consciousness is driving that vehicle. And we come to the conclusion that we need to change the driver of the vehicle because we need to take control. We, the essence, the consciousness, the very heart of who we are as individual people, needs to take control of our personality. And the only way we can do that is to be in the moment. It is not an intellectual thing, it is a conscious thing. And we know that obviously the intellect is in the mind and the consciousness is in the heart. So we need to start to look at living our life in a different way. Okay, so how does this work? We need to nourish the essence. Okay, so the essence we have, the free essence we have within us, we need to, as a child grows and develops, we need to give a lot of affection and love. But also for all of us as students of Gnosis, we need to encounter beauty on a daily basis. So often that comes best from Mother Nature, whether we can go out for a walk in the park, whether we can go into the garden if we've got a garden or an access to a garden, even plant some seeds if we want to do that, is to integrate with that love and beauty of Mother Nature. Obviously, then also we could do music or get involved with art or go to the countryside so that the sweetness and wisdom can manifest through the personality, the sweetness and wisdom of the essence in active control of the personality we have in any particular moment. Okay, and that picture there is supposed to be a very nice representation of that. The ego manifests through the impressions received from the surrounding environment, and it reacts to the work, the family, the systems, the media, etc. So when we're in the traffic jam, we are very worked up and worried because we're late. We are getting very annoyed at the person in front because they obviously can't drive. They haven't got a driving license. How can they possibly have a driving license? They're such a bad driver. Um, we often find ourselves thinking about, worrying about, or arguing with, for example, family members. Then there's all these systems we have around us, the systems which control our work, where we go to earn money. All of that is made up of a load of people, as far as the ego is concerned, who are just a bunch of, you could say, wasters. People, our bosses are often crazy and they don't think right and they don't act right because we are projecting our own internal reality, our own egoic reality onto those people around us, onto those situations, onto those moments in our life. And instead of being conscious and living and being here and now, instead we are reacting to the impressions that come in to the human machine through our eyes, through the five senses, through the touch, the smell, the taste, etc. In other words, we are not living a true life. but it is the life which most people, most of humanity are living within. So it starts to get a little bit matrixy now. If you saw the film The Matrix, this is where we are more or less at the moment. Okay. So we're trying to move on from the failure of the systems, failure of the fact that the ego manifests in all those moments without consciously developing the personality positively. Okay. So if we don't try to develop our personality positively, it could overwhelm the essence and we could become, in the words of Master Samael, an uncontrolled rascal. We would be all over the place, very mischievous, doing lots of bad things, half bad things, dodgy things, whatever. Okay. Or if the essence persisted within the personality, it could create someone who is a stupid saint. So that phrase from the master, he's talking about someone who, for example, they may earn money, say, I don't know, £500, and then rather than keep it for the family, they give it all away to charity. Well, what are the family going to do? That's been a bit of a crazy situation that person has put himself in because he is a stupid saint. That's a very rough example of that. So, therefore, it would be logical that we need to achieve a balance between these two aspects, between the essence and the personality being in control of us in any moment, which means we get to the scales. And this is achieved by making what the master calls the right effort to understand the egos that manifest through our thoughts and feelings and actions, and to create the balance needed to generate a true personality. So, how do we do that? Well, to begin to make this thing called the right effort is to try in our daily life to start to observe ourselves, to start to see how we operate with the intention to change ourselves. And this, everything we've just described leads us, as we said with the bus, we need to change who is driving our personality. We need to change who is in charge of us in any moment. We need to stop being marionettes or puppets of the ego, and we need to take control of our life. So that rather than being horizontal, flat, we're born, we grow up, and then eventually we die. We want to develop spiritually on the vertical part as well. So how do we do this? Excuse me. If we go back to this image, okay, so we have this free consciousness inside our psychology. And as you can see on the right-hand side, we have the egos, a multiplicity. Again, we'll talk about more about this multiplicity in future weeks. Many, many egos. And inside each one of those egos is a little bit of trapped consciousness. Okay. So what we ideally need to do is try to understand how these egos are operating inside us in any moment. If we understand how they work and why they work and the reason for the ego, then we can start to say, okay, this is what I need to change. This is what I need to do within me to help me go from what I am, being very honest with ourselves, this is what I am, to what I would like to be, but I can't even describe what that would be like. Imagine having no ego, for example. That is a goal, but at the same time, we can't really explain what that would be like. Okay, so if we look at this on the right, oh no, sorry, on the left, I'm back to front. So on the left-hand side, we have, as you can see, that consciousness needs to awaken. So the free essence or consciousness we have in our psychology needs to awaken. It needs to be active. Okay. At the moment, most of the time, for most people, that consciousness is not active, it is passive. So if we can awaken that consciousness and then start to observe what is happening. I'm just going to move this bit. Hold on. Yeah. You can see on the right hand side thoughts, feelings, and actions. Okay. So I'll explain in future weeks why the actions is there rather than elsewhere on that picture. But there is a logic as to why it's at the bottom of the torso, not anywhere else. But we'll come back to that. So any particular ego, the cloud in the middle, okay, can express in any moment, if we are identified with it, it can express in our thoughts and feelings and actions. Any combination could be all three, normally is all three, but to start with, it could initially come as a thought about any situation, a reaction to the fact that we're going to miss the bus, for example. Oh my word, what am I going to do? I'm going to miss the bus. And then all the feelings, oh no, if I miss that bus, I'll miss the flight at the airport and blah, blah, blah. And then the action is, well, we start to run crazily. And then we get to the bus stop and realize that we're actually, the clock's changed and the hour, we've got the hour to relax. So um, the ego can manifest through the thoughts, feelings, or actions. Okay. So we need to start to observe this happening in our daily life um, as the observer. So we, the free consciousness inside us, who we are, the very true divine part of who we are in any moment, needs to be active, awakened, and needs to be the observer. And at the same time, it will be observing this side of that image. In other words, it will be observing all those egos. Okay. We are going to uh, carry out a practice called the observer and the observed, where we decide consciously to split our psychology like this so that we can see the ego manifesting through the thoughts and feelings and actions. We can see how we are working mechanistically. We can see how we are as a master says, humanoids. We are humanoids, not human. We're robotic. Okay. Forget AI for the moment. So basically, what we're saying is we're going to do a practice called the observer and the observed. Okay. And we'll be doing that in more detail next time, next week. Uh, but the point is that we are going to start to learn about who we are. And by observing who we are, we begin to find out the reality of our internal worlds. And in itself, that is our own gnosis or the beginning of our own gnosis. You remember we said last week, gnosis is objective, personal wisdom. Okay. So when we discover the way an ego works inside us, no one else can take that away from us because it's our understanding and our comprehension of that particular ego. We have it. It is completely pure objective knowledge. And as soon as we try to explain it to somebody else, we lose it. It becomes subjective. But the gnosis, the objective part, is the beginning of the change of our spiritual work. Master Samael says, really, all of us as students of Gnosis should be looking towards making a radical change. It's not just changing for a whim, it's radical because when we change, we are going to completely modify the way we live our life. We still be the same person. We still have the same physical, etc., etc., obviously. But in any particular moment, psychologically, we will be aware of who we are. We will start to see life with the capital L in a different way. And when we see it in a different way, we start to change. And when we change, other people around us, all of our interactions, all the situations, all the people we meet also get impacted by that change. So we can say very generally that in doing this work, we're going to improve our life and those around us. Okay. This is one of the great benefits of uh, Gnosis and learning these tools and techniques. So I think we come to the end. So I'm going to stop sharing now. Okay. So we're now going to do a practice. Okay. Um, I think it's probably best if I stop the recording because you don't want a load of people with their eyes closed for 10 minutes. That'd be a very strange recording, wouldn't it? Um, so I'll stop it now.